Praise the Lord. Today we're going to read Genesis chapter 30, 1 to 13. The maids' children were named by Leah and Rachel. And when Rachel saw that she bare Jacob no children, Rachel envied her sister and said unto Jacob, Give me children, or else I die. And Jacob's anger was kindled against Rachel, and he said, Am I in God's stead, who hath withheld from thee the fruit of the womb? And she said, Behold, my maid Bilhah, go in unto her, and she shall bear upon my knees, that I may also have children by her. And she gave him Bilhah, her handmaid, to wife. And Jacob went in unto her, and Bilhah conceived, and bare Jacob a son. And Rachel said, God hath judged me, and hath also heard my voice, and hath given me a son. Therefore called she his name Dan. And Bilhah, Rachel's maid, conceived again, and bare Jacob a second son. And Rachel said, With great wrestlings have I wrestled with my sister, and I have prevailed. And she called his name Naphtali. When Leah saw that she had left bearing, she took Zilpah her maid, and gave her to Jacob to wife. Gave her Jacob to wife. And Zilpah, Leah's maid, bare Jacob a son. And Leah said, A troop cometh, and she called his name Gad. And Zilpah, Leah's maid, bare Jacob a second son. And Leah said, Happy am I, for the daughters will call me blessed. And she called his name Asher. Again, reading in verse number 1, it says, And when Rachel saw that she bare Jacob no children, Rachel envied her sister, and said unto Jacob, Give me children, or else I die. It was in that form of voice and manner and behavior and words, we shall say it was desperation from Rachel. For in those days, having children was like a necessity or a big blessing. The more, the merrier. Especially male descendants were primarily beneficial for the family. Later, it was basically the strength of, we could say, the family, the tribe, and the entire nation for monetary purposes as well, and due to the caring for the elderly one once one gets of age. Rachel was seeing her sister Leah. Of course, she was having so many children, so she was extremely embarrassed. On one side, Leah was embarrassed due to the fact that her sister had gotten most of the love from Jacob. But then God blessed Leah in order for her to have more children and most of the family, we could say. Thus, Rachel could not have but two children, and not until the last of them all. And she did enjoy only one, really, during her uh, last days, we can say, Joseph. And then, when she had Benjamin, or Ben-Oni as she called him, she had passed away. Thus she had enough love from Jacob, but she had lacked her children for quite some time. Therefore, that envy had really caused her to get angry. She turned her anger towards Jacob, the one who loved her the most, and threatened him, basically, with her own death if he would not give her children. Of course, one should know that it was due to God and not due to Jacob, for he himself could not produce male offspring. But she could not get pregnant due to God's hand in the matter. And Jacob had an answer for Rachel, trying to explain that he himself was not God in order to provide the children that she wished. It was God's hand in the matter, so Rachel should turn to God and pray to Him for an answer. One of the questions might be, did Rachel actually pray to God for children beforehand? Maybe she didn't. Maybe Rachel did start praying once Jacob's reply said, that it was due to God's hand. Maybe then she realized she needed to turn to God. Therefore, Rachel may have started to pray for children. The sad part is Rachel was desired by Jacob from the beginning. So it was actually her own dad that had really caused a lot of the problems within the family of Jacob. For both Jacob and Rachel were in love, and not giving love to Leah was really not Jacob's fault either, though it was expected from God, and we could say expected from Laban because she became Jacob's wife. That is, Leah did. And he was married, Leah was married to Jacob. It is kind of like realizing that one needs to love others, even though that they may not be the ones that one gets along with. The truth is, God expects us to love everyone, though, of course, in marriage, love is different. It should be. Verse number 2. And Jacob's anger was kindled against Rachel, and he said, Am I in God's stead, who hath withheld from thee the fruit of the womb? Jacob had told Rachel frankly that it was God that was doing it to Rachel, and not he. Therefore, Jacob had gotten upset at Rachel, even showing some anger towards Rachel for her misunderstanding, and anger directed towards him. Yet, what was the best solution? The best solution would have been that both Jacob and Rachel should have prayed together for Rachel to have children. That would have been the best solution and the best model for others to follow. Man is very limited in what he can do, yet God can do so much for us. Nevertheless, the best is always to pray to God for help. Rachel had the right answer, to pray for children. Verse 3. And she said, Behold, my maid Bilhah, go in unto her, and she shall bear upon my knees, that I may also have children by her. It seems that Bilhah was a means for children to be born, and that way Rachel could call those children her own. Nevertheless, the reality was they had formed their own tribe in the end, anyhow. Thus, when the two wives, both Leah and Rachel, state that they would call those children theirs, I'm not sure exactly how that worked out, for they had really became their own tribes. Though the two maids probably did not share the same type of love that Rachel or even Leah received from Jacob, for it would have gotten, of course, Jacob in trouble, I suppose. Yet, because the children were Jacob's, then those children became heirs of the covenant promise. Therefore, it was not through the matriarchal lineage, but through the dad, that is, Jacob. In verse number 4 it says, And she gave him Bilhah, her handmaid, to wife. And Jacob went in unto her. And God had known how this was to come about, that Jacob would have more children, even not from Leah and Rachel. There were two sons born to each maid, two from Bilhah and two from Zilpah. The idea was for Jacob to have more sons, and God blessed him with 12 sons. The question comes up, though, with all those sons, who do the 12 sons get wives from? Some traditional sources say that the sons of Jacob got wives from Esau's descendants, others, Ishmael's descendants. And of course, Joseph married a wife from Egypt, and Judah, he married a Canaanite, the one that should have married differently. But Tamar then came into the picture for producing the heir for Judah and the daughter-in-law. Yet Tamar's parents, we know not where they come from, though there is speculation that Tamar's parents were through the line of Shem. And that could very well be. Why would the Bible be silent, though, about where most of the wives for the sons of Jacob had come from? And besides Joseph and Judah, which were um, present in the text. Speculation is that they may have even had wives from Canaan, as Judah's was. Yet the truth is, it is not found within biblical sources. The only focus, though, is on the sons. With Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, though, the wives are mentioned. And the wives for those three patriarchs are known. They are even named. Sarah is mentioned as one of faith, no doubt, and Rebecca must have been just the same. And Leah and Rachel, they're probably very much like two sisters that were, of course, having a number of problems due to love and attention from Jacob, a bit of pride due to the number of sons, that is Leah. But mostly she may not have had that pride in her, for it was a basis that she wished more love from Jacob, and God basically granted that to happen. Jacob himself did not reject the offers of the two maids for wives either. Jacob seems to follow what his wives had directed for him in many cases, the wives and many other things. That showed that Jacob did love Leah and Rachel, but an extraordinary love for Rachel, no doubt. Yet Jacob did not have a written Bible in order to show him and as an example to respect each wife equally. Instead, he was the example for others, that others should be treated equally. And you know that it also is portrayed that Jacob didn't name those sons. Leah named the sons of the maids. Jacob didn't have any part in naming the children, and Rachel named her the sons from Bilhah. God had given unto Bilhah, Rachel's maid, children before even giving Rachel any children. Could Rachel have blamed God? It was not Rachel's fault per se, due to Jacob loving her more than Leah. It just turned out that way. In fact, she had gotten the short end of the stick, so to speak, of the fact that she and Leah both were put into that situation by her own dad. An influence upon Jacob's life that God had granted the wishes of Laban. Good for the whole family, I suppose, though not necessarily the desire of Jacob. In the end, though, after he aged, he probably realized that it was better that way in his case, though in reality, at the beginning, he really did not know how to face Laban. It was an injustice, but Jacob too had brought it upon himself due to the fact that he, in all reality, had deceived his own father too. In verse number 6, it says, And Rachel said, God hath judged me, and hath also heard my voice, and hath given me a son. Therefore called she his name Dan. Here is a hint that Rachel might have listened to Jacob and then began praying to God, though she had done what Sarah had done by giving her husband, Jacob, over to her mate. Of course, nowadays, people by law are to have, that is in the United States, only one wife. Back then, they could have more than one wife, even in Israel during the making of the law of Moses, too. Rachel named Dan instead of Bilhah, naming her own child. Bilhah might have been very pleased that she could have a son and take care of him, and in return, when she would get older, Dan would probably take care of her too. Thus, that was a privilege for Bilhah. We know naught of her feelings in the family. We are given the feelings to some degree of Leah and Rachel, but that is basically the fighting between each other, or the competition, we could say. But it is silent regarding Bilhah and Zilpah, both maids. Furthermore, we know not where they had actually come from. though we suspect that they may have come from Haran originally because that's where they were found. But we know not specifically, though it is quite certain that they may not have been Canaanite women, and they probably did not even act like Canaanite women. In any case, Rachel must have prayed, and through her prayer and her idea of giving to Jacob Bilhah as a wife, then God had heard that desire and prayer of Rachel. Yet it was probably her own prayer for herself to get pregnant. But still, God had waited for the proper moment and according to his plan and timing. In verse number 7 it says, "And Bilhah, Rachel's maid, conceived again, and bare Jacob a second son." Rachel was happy that Bilhah had two boys, though it was not really the same as having sons coming from her own womb. They just made it more palatable for her not to have children from her own womb, for she could boast that the sons were her own. She had named them too. Dan was named by Rachel, which meant judge, for Rachel had mentioned that God had judged. Verse 8 says, "And Rachel said, With great wrestlings have I wrestled with my sister, and I have prevailed. And she called his name Naphtali." Rachel seemed to be in a competition with her sister, for her sister had so many sons, but she had none. Therefore, when her maid had given birth to two sons, then Rachel was happy, for she would claim them as her own and name them too. However, in naming them, it was almost as though she was not recognizing her own maid's rights in what she might have wanted to name them. However, she was indeed quite humiliated by her sister receiving so many sons, but all of them, obviously, were from God, indeed. Naphtali means wrestling, which actually refers to Rachel struggling or wrestling with her own sister. It is more of showing the inner turmoil of Rachel's feelings of being humiliated, and wishing to have children of her own. Even though Naphtali and Dan are not from her own womb, because they are from her maid, it seems to support the idea that she could claim them as her own. Rachel named them, so it was in fact, a way of being satisfied that at least she could say she had children and not be humiliated more from Leah, her own sister. Though one would think that since they are sisters, they would have love for one another. And instead of Leah always desiring love from her husband, she could have had, a good deal of love for her sister. But it seems like it is more in competition. Verse number 9, when Leah saw that she had left bearing, she took Zilpah her maid and gave her Jacob to wife. Leah seized the fact that Bilhah had borne two children, and she had left off from bearing. So she wished to bear children through her maid just as much. With the struggle of Leah and Rachel giving Jacob their maids, it is as though Jacob is being tossed from one lady to the next. Leah then copies what her sister had done. First, it was Rachel's idea, but Leah wished to get more sons through her maid too. Will she also do the same? That is, name the child that comes from her maid? Or will she allow her maid to name the child? That's a question. This shows quite a lot of competition within one's own family for having more sons to add. Today, this competition is not precisely for physical children, so to speak, but it is in churches in general for spiritual children. The competition is strong, and there could even be that desire to make others within the same organization, so to speak, envious, for the bigger churches are causing, per se, other smaller churches to become envious to some degree. In verse number 10, it says, And Zilpah, Leah's maid, bare Jacob a son. All of these children, too, by the way, are Abraham's descendants. God had promised that God would make Abraham's descendants plentiful, so plentiful, like the sand on the seashore or the stars in the sky. For Jacob, he was seeing a blessing in great numbers of children. Therefore, he could believe it by seeing it actually happen to him, that so many sons were being born. Yet, he did not exactly plan it that way. That is the funny thing about it. His plans were probably much different, but God had allowed the sisters to have that competition between them so as to have more sons come forth. Even though these sons are coming from maids, they are still considered to be Abraham's descendants, more directly from Jacob, who is the father of these children. But God was the one who provided these souls to the family that would eventually be called Israel. Though Jacob at the time knew not of his future, but God knew everything that was going to happen. And so let's read verse number 11. And it says, And Leah said, A troop cometh. And she called his name Gad. Yes, it is true. Leah follows exactly in her sister's footsteps. She also gave Jacob her maid for a wife, and she also likewise had named Zilpah's son, who, it can be stated, she recognized the baby as her own. Further, she had called the son Gad, kind of like the meaning of, quote, a troop cometh, end quote, and a tad bit of a meaning of good fortune too. Thus, it sounds like, in English, the fact that so many sons were coming from her and then from her maid, even from Rachel's maid. And that might have been the idea, because the family was growing so large. Then she exclaimed, A troop cometh, like a fighting force, one that could protect the whole family in the future as a fighting force. Thus, in one respect, Rachel, we could say in this aspect, she was the leader because she was the one who had the idea first by having Jacob take her maid so that the maid could bear sons and that she would name them. Rachel then had established something that made the family grow even larger to some degree. And Leah followed suit, content and following her younger sister's idea, even naming the son that had come from Zilpah. Verse 12 says, And Zilpah, Leah's maid, bare Jacob a second son. The interesting part of this is, too, the fact that both maids birthed two sons each. Therefore, there was probably no competition between the maids. The competition, instead, was just between the two sisters, Leah and Rachel. God had it already in his mind how many sons Jacob would have, for those would be included in the tribes, except, of course, Joseph, whose sons Ephraim and Manasseh would come those tribes too and receive their inheritance that way. In verse number 13 it says, And Leah said, Happy am I, for the daughters will call me blessed. And she called his name Asher. Leah, from, she might say in future, Zilpah, had a son, but she would call it her child and even name the child also, just like her sister had done. She seemed also to be very happy, too. The name Asher was that which signified happy or blessed. And so it was. The family was blessed. Thus, through the two maids, Bilhah and Zilpah, having two sons each, these four sons had their names given, two from Leah, two from Rachel, rather than from their direct mother, who, of course, the two mothers were Bilhah and Zilpah. One can see distinctly the fact that even in righteous families, so to speak, in the families that righteousness and justice should reign, and these are given as examples. Not always was there a justice that took place totally due to people's desires, or maybe we can say their selfishness in some cases. One could say that both Leah and Rachel did name those children from their maids as a way to claim them as their own, being, shall we say, a bit selfish in their prospects. Even though these examples have been provided for Christians too, in the Old Testament and throughout the entire Christian era, still there are those Christians who seem to have modeled after the Old Testament and doing the same. And that would be during the time of slavery in the USA, for example. Slaves were bought and sold. Their children were not really considered their own, but they could have been bought by the slave owners, even divided up, given names, done with pretty much as they pleased. Yet, God is the one who is looking down from heaven above to each injustice that takes place. Thankfully, today in the USA, at least by law, there's no slavery that is recognized. May God bless you today. In Jesus' name. Amen.